Is it possible to rehabilitate a psychopath? I've always loved the way Cleckley answers this in his book. The therapist has little more opportunity to take useful measures than a surgeon called upon to remove the gallbladder of a jackrabbit in full flight.
The moment the big break with Earl came, I was in New York with my daughters, and my brother phoned me and told me, it's over. I said, what do you mean? What's happened? In fact, he had called to tell me that Earl Jones had cheated us out of all the money we had invested. The entire inheritance of my father and grandfather. It was a horrible shock. I knew then that all the doubts I'd had about Earl had become a reality, and that our family was in a terrible situation.
Earl Jones is believed to have defrauded 100 investors in Quebec, in Ontario, and in the United States. The so-called financial advisor has ruined so many lives.
A feeling of rage, of anger, and then you feel totally demoralized. You've no idea how to pick yourself up from this. It's very, very painful. At first, you're charmed by the person. And when they're very smart and very good at manipulation, they make you believe they have your best interests at heart. But they do it for their own gain, to lure you into their game. They use you, but they're very good at it. And that's the difficult thing. Some very smart people, some very respectable people have been fooled. And when it happens to you, when it smacks you in the face, you feel absolutely awful. It's a combination of anger at being betrayed in a relationship you had invested in, and a feeling of guilt and loss of self-esteem, and thinking, how could I have let myself be fooled?
There's a lot of people who told me they're alleged victims who've talked to me who said they were friends of yours, family members. They have a lot of questions for you. How did this happen?
I'll have to talk to my lawyer about that. I'm not allowed to under my bail notice. I'm not allowed to talk to anyone.
Now that I'm older and I've been through the experience with Earl Jones, it has really opened my eyes to how duplicitous someone can be. On the one hand, he was charming, fun, great to be around. But on the other hand, he was such a manipulative person. Earl is a pathological liar on a level that no one could even have imagined. Earl's a psychopath. He's someone who really comes looking for you. Someone who takes his time, takes great care, and works very hard to bring you into his trust. And once he knows he has earned your complete trust, boom, he will destroy you.
In September, Fife pleaded guilty to murdering 5 women. Today, police released names of 4 other women Fife says he killed.
The first time I met William Fife was at my store. He came in looking for work, maintenance, gardening, jobs like that. That was the first time I met him. He was a very polite guy. He was modest. He had a very good approach. He was kind and had a nice smile. He was a very pleasant guy. We started getting on friendlier terms, and he even offered to do a few jobs for me at my home. Then he invited me to play badminton with him on Tuesdays and Thursdays. He was in charge of the badminton sessions at the local public gym. He was very competitive, as I am, and we had a good time together. We trusted him completely. We could give the keys to our home and say, "Here you go. Do what you have to do." He was well liked by the community. He was always useful, always offering his services. He was a guy who was always ready to help people. He was seeing a local woman who was separated. She had 2 children, and Bill was like a father to them. He was always at home with them. When we played badminton, we wore our kit with short-sleeved shirts. And one time, his arms were all scratched. And he said he'd been clearing shrubbery and cutting trees. So I just thought, the guy's hurt himself cutting and carrying branches. He had scratches on his arms, but sometimes on his hands or face as well. And I just thought, okay. I never imagined they might have been caused by victims or anything.
On top of the 4 murders, which brought the supposed total to 9, Fife also admitted to a number of assaults and attempted murders.
My eldest son called me and said, "Dad, have you seen the news?" I said, "No, not yet. I'm still at work." He said, "Apparently Bill Fife's been arrested for murder." I couldn't believe it. Then he said, on the news, they said he's suspected of several murders, like a kind of serial killer. It didn't make sense. Not Bill. He's too nice a guy, and so calm. It was impossible to think of a guy like him being a sicko. We were all in total shock. How could it be possible? How could we have all been fooled by him? Because people like that fool us. They're not being honest with us. They live a hidden life and can't tell you the truth. It really made me think. Sometimes you meet other people. You open up to them. They earn your trust, and you earn theirs. But maybe you should be a bit warier. Once you've been through something like that, with a guy like that, the next time, you stay on your guard a lot more.
You look at the personality, and here's somebody that is all about me. I'm totally, as a psychopath, it's all about me. everything revolves around me. And really, I don't care about you. I care that I could maybe take what you've got that I want. But it's all self-gratification. And so the psychopath says, what's mine is mine, and what's yours is mine as well. For instance, when I'm interviewing somebody that I see as being fairly psychopathic, I will take my watch off, or I'll take something out of my pocket and I'll set it on the table between us. And I'll say, this is something that you want more than anything else in life, and it's mine. I'll set it on the table. How are you going to get it? With the non-psychopath, they'll look at me and say, well, I'll ask you for it. The psychopath looks at that and he goes, huh. He sits back and he gives me this little smirk. And I say, okay, how are you going to get that? He says, I'll get it. Well, how are you going to get it? Don't worry about it. I'll get it. It's like, it's a game. It's a game. It's a challenge. Are you smarter than me? Are you stronger than me? Can I take you? That is the attitude of psychopath. If I feel like I can get something from you with an open hand, I'll keep taking it, because this is an easy way. This is a con. I can con you. But if the con's not working and I want what you have, like say I want you sexually and you're not coming to me, I have other things that I can use. And so they will resort to violence in order to get their needs met. But a lot of people say, well, they're always violent. No. Violence is a useful tool for them.
You can't start treating people as psychopaths any which way just because they've committed a homicide. You often hear this: the guy committed murder, so he must be a psychopath. In the majority of cases, murderers aren't psychopaths. In fact, non-psychopaths commit more homicides than psychopaths, because murders generally happen through a loss of emotional self-control. We were having a fight, I lost my mind and killed my wife, for example. I saw red and killed one of my friends. A loss of emotional self-control is the cause of most homicides, whereas psychopaths are very much in control of their emotions. When psychopaths kill, they use instrumental violence, by which I mean it's targeted. The main characteristic of psychopaths is the search for power. Some do it through misdemeanors, some through violence, while others use different ways. Money, having several sexual partners, intimidating their entourage, bringing people down, humiliating them, displaying different behaviors, and not necessarily criminal behaviors.
I always am at the border. So I can say happily that I'm not a categorical clinical psychopath, but I come that close. And so I always hit, if 30 to 32 is the cutoff, I'm a 25 to 28, probably because I don't have the other half of the traits, which are very negative traits. They're what are called for the PPI, impulsive antisociality. I can be impulsive, but I can control my impulsivity. That is, I have done crazy things all my life that make people very nervous, but I choose to do it. It's not like I'm out of control and, I'm gonna get impulsive. It's very carefully thought out, and so people don't get hurt. They don't get killed, but they're always involved in something that scares the hell out of them. This has happened with my kids, with my brothers and people I know. The idea is, I'm gonna get you to do something you never thought you could do. And we're gonna go swimming with these sharks. We're going to go into this bush, into this jungle, and there's a sign saying, no trespassing, don't come in here because there's lions. But I said, here are the risks, and we're gonna go in and have the greatest time of the life. You're gonna smell you're gonna smell the lion dung, you're gonna smell the leopards, you're gonna smell all this, and you're going to be, just like running with the bulls in Pamplona, which I've done, And it was always a thrill. So it's about thrilling, thrill seeking, but also understanding what the odds are. So this is why psychopaths can be very successful, because they understand the odds. It's the idea that you know how to balance risk and reward. There's no good moral reasoning. They don't think what they're doing is morally wrong. So when they're caught by the police or their wife or their husband doing something awful, it's like, no, that's not me. It's like the old, who do you believe, me or your lying eyes? And so psychopaths can do this because in their hearts, in their souls, they don't believe what they're doing is immoral.
A psychopath, even if he's quietly strolling along Rue Saint-Denis or Rue Sainte-Catherine, is still a psychopath. He's not doing anything wrong. You cannot arrest him for committing a crime or a misdemeanor. And yet, he is a psychopath. Why do I say that? Because he is nonetheless on a high, enjoying internal exaltation with an illusion of being almighty, and looking at things through the eyes of a true psychopath. He has a way of reading reality round the clock, 24/7, that is totally psychopathic, which is based on exploitation and contempt for all that is exploitable. Because naturally, he holds others in contempt. That's his state of mind. He's on a high, on a stage that's always present and which he craves. Of course, sometimes this high isn't always enough. And he needs to do something big to throw on a bit more fuel, to feed his high, his exaltation. That's how we must see them. Always high, always almighty, and always having a grandiose view of themselves. But at times, through the odd crime, he has to take a bigger dose of drugs to get high.
A lot of psychopaths have a big tendency to get bored. To them, for example, a stable relationship with a woman with no mistress is terribly boring. They need constant stimulation. Having a stable job, a long-term job, is also exceedingly boring. We generally see them changing jobs very, very often, because after 2 weeks, a month, 2 months, 3 months, they're bored stiff. They need stimulation in every walk of life, in their leisure activities, in their private life, in their sex life, in consumption, often of stimulating drugs, across the entire reward circuit, what we call the dopaminergic circuit. They have a tendency to need a lot of stimulation, unlike mere mortals, so to speak.
We often see in psychopaths a need for stimulation, for excitement, for risk-taking. About those who are in prison for murders, etc., we go, wow, he really showed how twisted he is. Inside a company, at first it can be seen as a strength, and it can help them climb the ranks. Daring and risk-taking are valued and rewarded. And people don't see through this daring entrepreneurial spirit and risk-taking, not realizing that this person is dangerous and will cross lines that shouldn't be crossed. That's not obvious at first. But in the end, this need to stretch limits, to constantly stretch them in search of stimulation, will result in behaviors that are very harmful to the company. Rash decisions, actions where the end justifies the means. So, always looking for more control, more power.
The more you get, the more you want. There is a part of human behavior that rolls that way. I think with the psychopath, there might be an increased necessity of upping the ante, of getting more excitement as time goes on, and we see that with the more deviant individuals. You see sometimes the violence will increase as they commit offenses. Each time they commit an offense, the violence increases. And sometimes that's the need to satiate the fantasy that is within the person. We see that more with sex offenders than we do with anybody. Not that violent offenders don't have fantasy, they do too. But sex offenders are driven primarily by sexual fantasy. And so the need to have more seems to be more in keeping with the psychopathic sex offender than anyone.
What's interesting about movies is they show us how the image of the psychopath evolves within society. How society answers the question, what is a psychopath? Movies tend to show us psychopaths as murderers, for example. We've seen this with The Silence of the Lambs, with Clockwork Orange, and with American Psycho. So very common in the 80s and 90s. And recently, there's been another evolution. Now we're shown that psychopaths aren't necessarily murderers. Some psychopaths are functional psychopaths who invest, for example, in the business world. The problem with movies is they're not necessarily good depictions of what psychopathy is. They're exaggerated characterizations of psychopathy. But if I had to give you a few examples, I'd pick out Leonardo DiCaprio in The Wolf of Wall Street, which is a good depiction of the functional psychopath, who has a need for admiration, who seeks extreme sensations, and has that general lack of empathy. That's present throughout the narrative of the movie.
You finally found a broker on Wall Street that you can trust and who can consistently make you money. Sound fair enough?
Another interesting movie, which I mentioned before, is American Psycho with Christian Bale. Here, the character is a half-functional psychopath, so we're still in the business world in Wall Street, and a half-psychopath who commits violent crimes. What's interesting about this movie is that it shows us the whole functional cycle of the psychopath. There's a whole process in which he has to get angry and feel like he's a victim of an injustice in order to take action.
And though I can hide my cold gaze, and you can shake my hand and feel flesh gripping yours, and maybe you can even sense our lifestyles are probably comparable, I simply am not there.
Regarding the sex crimes of a psychopath, these can vary from one psychopath to the next. Some psychopaths commit sex crimes in search of stimulation. Others will do it purely to satisfy their immediate sexual needs. I have an urgent sexual need. I have to find someone who will satisfy that sexual need. And within that context, they might go out and commit opportunistic rapes. Then there are other psychopaths who are more sadistic rapists. They have deviant sexual interests and fantasies from which they obtain sexual excitement by inflicting pain on others and observing that pain. They are generally rapists who are very organized people. They will plan their crime. They watch their victim, check their routines, what time she leaves for work, what time she comes home from work, whether she stays alone, whether she has a dog, whether she has a guy. And if so, what time does he come home? So they meticulously plan their crime in order to commit it in an isolated place where there's no risk of being caught in the act. And all these crimes have a sadistic side to them. Not only are they very well organized, they are planned to humiliate the victim, to inflict pain in order to provide sexual excitement.
Stabbed 55 times. That was his bloody trademark. His murders covered a 20-year period. All his victims had in common was they were women who lived alone.
The worst case scenario, as I refer to as the nastiest cocktail, is to have somebody that is both psychopathic and sadistic. There's a wide array of psychopaths, and you have this successful, quote-unquote successful white-collar psychopath, and then you have the guy that basically is just in and out of prison at the other end, right? But all the way through, there are psychopaths in every layer of society. And so the brain of the guy that's going in and out of prison, committing violent acts, and the guy that's moving up the ladder in business may be the exact same. But they have learned, whether it's through higher IQ, better socialization, less neglect and rejection in childhood, they've learned to manipulate better at this end than they have at this end.
You know, if you look at a human, a developing human from birth onwards to an adult, there are about what are called 350 specific behaviors. And those behaviors will develop by themselves. You don't, even the sense of morality, balance, art, beauty, ugliness, people have when they're, very early. So basic personality traits are genetically determined. But nobody's wired to be a murderer. Nobody's wired to be a psychopath. But there are some of these genes that are consistent with psychopathy and other personality disorders that mostly are regulated by what are called promoters. It's like the gas pedal in your car. The engine is the gene, but there are gas pedals that turn higher and lower if you need it. Sometimes you need the warrior genes to fight off somebody who's attacking you or your family. There's like a time and a place and a level for everything. If somebody has certain combination of genes, which makes them susceptible to trauma, and they are abused or abandoned, like they have no father or they're sexually or emotionally abused, this is bad news. This is somebody who's can be almost like an inevitable psychopath, but you have to have a combination of genetic alleles and you have to have some trauma in your life. And that affects these promoters. It's like the gas pedal. It's like you put a brick on the gas pedal and it's on all the time. So it becomes independent of the social context. So here's somebody who is aggressive, violent all the time. Somebody who is sexually aggressive all the time.
When you look at a sample of psychopathic people, what are the risk factors that were present in their environment? What factors correlate with the development of psychopathy? Parental supervision, for example. In many psychopaths, there were problems with parental supervision. Parents who didn't provide a clear disciplinary framework, parents whose discipline was too strict or too physical. They used corporal punishment. The fact of coming from a big family, of coming from a family that commits crimes, of frequenting antisocial children at school.
Nature loads the gun, but nurture fires the bullet. And it's the reason why one of my main concerns is to make sure that children are not abused and neglected. So I say to conferences and to politicians everywhere, put your money upstream, fish upstream. Fish upstream, put your money into the children. Somebody will say to me, well, Dr. Logan, isn't it truly we should be starting at age 12 and really doing stuff for these kids? The train left the station. Like, this is long gone. We've already missed it. Let's start at least age 6, 7, 8. Let's get things in place. And let's take the kids that are showing the effects of the abuse and neglect coming into the school system, and let's focus in on them and pour more resources and get more help with them so that we can steer them in a better place. And my belief is that if we own them, my belief is that these are the ones that we should be focusing on, because these are the ones that are going to hurt us in society.
I was present at the trial, at all of his parole hearings. For years, he kept saying it was other people's fault, not his own. He accepted no responsibility. It was always someone else's fault. It was his father's fault because he was a former soldier and he mistreated him. It was his brother's fault because he had sexually abused him. Always the fault of others, always. I would never say that he's ready to reintegrate society, because at his last hearing, he was still lying. So I don't believe he can be reintegrated. That's why I want to speak out, because once back in society, he could do the same things again. And the guy's in his 60s. What do you do as a 65-year-old man going back into society? You've nothing. No qualifications, no money. You're a psychopath? What do you do? They let him out to work. I'm told he does 6 to 8 hours as a kitchen hand. It's supposedly to help him reintegrate. It's in the building opposite, so there's just one street to cross. He's not supposed to mix with anyone, but there are students in that building, and I heard they're all young girls. That's not very reassuring. I'm against his release. Totally against it. It's not me who decides, I'm well aware of that, but I'm determined to speak out and make sure it doesn't happen. The guy's dangerous.
Whether they're a psychopath or non-psychopath, most people will do their best to be released. So sure, in prison, lots of people take part in programs, not because they think they have a problem, but because they know it's their best chance of being released. Psychopaths are very good at making a good impression. When they're in prison, many of them, but not all, they're capable of behaving quite normally for a long period of time, because they know they need that to be released. They're capable of exerting self-control for a long time, because there's a reward at the end. For psychopaths, there must often be a reward. A carrot on the end of a stick is very important to them. When they sniff a chance of being released, their behavior will improve a lot in the hope of obtaining a release on parole. Plus, they're very good at getting important people on their side and obtaining good reports from them. So at their parole hearing, their file will be full of good reports from people that count.
When I was at his last parole hearing, he was asked lots of questions. And he kept coming back to how people were still angry with him. Then he asked for forgiveness. But what he's never understood, and I repeat this, is that people are scared of him. I feel safe when I know he's inside. But thinking he might come out, I made it clear I want to know where he is and what he's doing. He would have to go into a transitional home. Where is this transitional home? In which city? Because I want to protect myself from the guy. And other members of my family think the same thing. You cannot not be afraid once you've had dealings with him. It's impossible.
Psychopaths are a case apart because they're not easy to evaluate. Parole officers are very concerned about the rehabilitation of the prisoner and about the protection of the public, and notably, the protection of the victim who suffered irreparable damage years ago. Being a psychopath is not a reason for non-approval in itself. Parole officers mustn't base their decisions on the stereotypical thinking of what a psychopath is. They must examine every detail of the case. How has the person behaved during the incarceration in spite of his psychopathy? Has he learned lessons from his punishment? Has he tried to rehabilitate? Did he participate in prison programs? Is he still haunted by violent thoughts? Is he still ultra-narcissistic? Does he still display a lack of empathy towards others? Has he made progress with no disciplinary failings, no serious violence? In short, they genuinely try to put together a portrait of someone who, if released, will uphold the conditions and not present a danger to the public. Other than what the prisoner says, there's a lot of other information. There are 10, 15, maybe 20 years of incarceration and long-term behavior to assess before finally drawing a conclusion on their danger level.
The psychopath is pretty much beyond rehabilitation. What we hope for is a burnout, by which I mean that with age, the psychopath runs out of fuel and becomes calmer. Just like me and you, right? He calms down with age. In criminology, this was called psychopathic burnout. That is why, in Canada, laws were passed to declare that certain dangerous psychopaths, rather than give them a calculated sentence of 6 years, 10 years, 15 years, would be given an undefined prison sentence until a qualified professional observes that his psychopathic fuel has started to burn out.
You can't cure a psychopath, right? And the word cure is interesting because we're talking about actually changing them from the inside out. So what we don't want to do is cure anybody. What we want to do is in treatment, is we want to show them that there's a different way of thinking. If you always think this way, you'll always get the same results. If the result ends you up in prison, you might want to change your thinking. So we'll work in a cognitive behavioral way to change your thinking so you won't end up here again. That's your best interest. And that is the way, the only way that we can make sense to the psychopath. And I believe that some of them are capable of changing their thinking. I don't think we have any choice in the matter of release. We can't hold a person in prison because they're psychopathic. I don't believe we could change the law to say if a person scored over 30 on the PCLR, we could keep them in beyond their warrant expiry. I don't think that will ever happen. I think there's room, especially in Canada, for harder sentences, for harsher sentences, for violent crime. So I just worked a case in the United States where a guy sexually assaulted 2 stepdaughters. He's going to get 50 years in prison. I had another case in Ontario where the guy did the exact same thing. The girls were the same age. The case was almost identical. He got 2 years in prison. So there's a disparity in what we do in Canadian law that I think needs to be looked at.
We got justice of a kind because Earl did go to prison. And you can't say that for all victims of swindlers. I think Earl should have been given life. He spent 3 or 4 years inside, and now he's back on the street. The seriousness of financial crimes is hard for people to understand because on the outside, you look unharmed. But inside, it's like an incurable cancer.
He's out of jail and living in Westmount with his wife. In fancy Westmount, not in some housing project. I don't mean any disrespect, but he lives in Westmount. He's not in the street, he's not poor. And there were people who lost all they had over him, and they died. There were people who couldn't afford their medicines or groceries. We formed a group to issue coupons so people could buy groceries. There are people who are still poor, for whom things will never get back to how they were before. And their aggressor, their swindler, is with his wife and still sees his family? What does he live on? I'd like to know. I'm sure he hid money for when he was released. I'm sure he planned for that. So where's the money?
I don't know how Earl is living his life now, but I did have one very strange moment. I was in my car on René Levesque Boulevard, sitting at a red light, when suddenly I saw a man who looked like Earl Jones cross in front of me. I had my hands on the steering wheel and I said, "Oh my God, it's Earl." And just as I realized it was him, the light turned green and I had to drive off. But it was very strange seeing him again. And it told me something. He affected me, my family, and so many others. But there he was, back strolling across René Levesque, well-dressed, and life goes on for him.
I think one of the ways we protect society is with police having more of a knowledge, with prosecutors having more of a knowledge, with judges having more of a knowledge about this phenomenon called psychopathy, to the fact that there are some people that are just more dangerous than others. And so we have to deal with them in a different way. And the more education that we roll out, the better off we are in terms of public safety. Getting factual information out to people is very important. If I see somebody who has these traits, I want to be a little bit cautious around them because maybe I won't trust them when they come over and tell me about this lovely financial scheme that they're involved in and you can invest in it, right? Or maybe I won't leave my children with this particular individual to care for them or to even, have surveillance of them in the playground. It's protecting ourselves with knowledge because the psychopaths are among us.